Welcome to the next episode of Two Guys Discussing Ukraine now over pastries. And our guest today is Kimberly Marten from Bernard College, Columbia University. And we want to ask you, Kim, a question. Should US supply offensive weapon to Ukraine?
Sufian, thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about this, because this is one of the hot issues right now in U.S. domestic politics. And I think the answer is clearly no, for three reasons. The first is that the Ukrainian military is not a very professionalized organization. It doesn't even have a lot of support in terms of its command structure across Ukrainian society. And the concerns are that it is not very good at having command and control, even over what its own troops do, that it also has this tendency to be penetrated by Russian agents and to sometimes be corrupt. So that's the first problem. We don't have a reliable Ukrainian military partner. The second problem is that there are so many different informal militias fighting in Ukraine on behalf of Kiev's interests, but often with their own agendas. And some of those own agendas come from even different countries. So some of those militias are actually based in Chechnya, and they're in Ukraine because they want to fight the Russians anywhere they can fight the Russians. Some of those militias are very much tied to patronage networks with businesses who might be engaged in smuggling, might be engaged in other forms of international arms sales. And so that means that from those militias, the weapons could seep out into the international arms market or even into the hands of Russia. And the third reason is that even though we know that Putin will say whatever he wants to about what the U.S. is doing, if the United States comes out and openly says we are supplying offensive weapons to Ukraine, it's going to give lots of support to Putin in the message that he's been trying to put across this year, which is that Ukraine isn't about the Ukrainian people. It isn't about ethnicity or language. That what Ukraine is really about is the United States threatening Russian borders. And so if we give him fodder for that kind of way of thinking, it's going to give him more popular support for the idea that what he has to do is ramp up the conflict. And I'm really afraid of where that might end up leading.
Well, thank you for delivering such clearly your message. But we know that not everybody in the United States and political establishment would agree. How about you, Robert? Would you agree with that?
Well, I thought that Kim's points are very well taken, and those are certainly the position that's been expressed by President Obama himself. But it seems that everybody else in Washington has a different point of view. And I think the arguments that they're making that make sense are, first of all, with the Euromaidan, the Ukrainian people basically made a civilizational choice. They said, we're sick of living in this corrupt society. We want to do something different. And so it's true, as Kim points out, that it's hard to see the Ukrainian military as a effective fighting force, although obviously it's evolved over the last years, become more effective, but still it's certainly questionable. However, we in the West have an obligation, I think, to help them protect this civilizational choice. So they basically, the people of Ukraine basically said, by chasing out their old president, we want to be less corrupt. And so in a sense, we have an obligation to defend them from doing that. And so I think the second thing is we can't base our policies on Putin's rhetoric. And so while Putin runs around saying this is about the West, and if we supplied weapons to Ukraine, it might give him more evidence, I think his propaganda machine is already arguing this anyways, regardless of facts on the ground. And so we certainly have the US and the EU have been working together very well coordinated, I think thanks to the President in part and thanks to the European partners, to provide Western aid to Ukraine. And so we've already been providing a huge amount of aid, and Putin's been making this clear in his rhetoric. So I'm not sure that providing the offensive weapons would really take it that much higher. So I'm not sure that that's really an argument. And the final thing is that certainly Ukraine doesn't need more weapons. The country is awash in weapons. They're one of the biggest weapons producers in the world, and we're certainly exporting a lot of weapons before the revolution. I'm not sure how it's going now. But they don't have the kind of sophisticated weapons that the Russians have and are supplying to the separatist forces in Ukraine. So in that sense, it might be useful to have, if the Ukrainians had a better sense of what's going on the battlefield, and then they were able to target their munitions more precisely at the soldiers. And so as we've seen from a lot of the fighting, the Ukrainians tend to shoot their rockets and they just land anywhere in the city and kill a lot of civilians. So one could make the argument that giving them better precision-guided missiles would actually make it possible for them to kill the tanks rather than the innocent civilian bystanders.
May I respond?
Sure.
Robert, I think you make a number of really good points, and I would just say the following. The first is that I'm all in favor of sharing technology with the Ukrainian military that would allow them to have better radar, better intelligence. I'm not against that at all. What I am against is the supplying of very high-precision offensive weapons for a couple of reasons that set those apart. The first is that they could be used for multiple purposes. Yes, they could be used to pinpoint the direction where the Russian attacks or the Russian-supported attacks are coming from, but they also could be used to hit civilian targets. And we know from also our experience in Afghanistan, for example, that when we supply weapons to the other side, they don't get just used in the immediate conflict. They get used elsewhere as well. When we're now talking about there being a significant Chechen component fighting in Ukraine, and when we know that there's also a significant Chechen component fighting in the Islamic State conflict that's happening in Syria, I think it would be disastrous if U.S. weapons that were supplied to Ukraine actually ended up being used against U.S. interests in Syria. So I think we have to worry about that as well. You made so many good points that I don't think I have time to answer all of them, but let me just say that I'm all in favor of supporting the Ukrainian people. And I think that means giving economic assistance, maybe not being so harsh with the conditionality requirements. But the one thing to think about, even with U.S. military training, is that the U.S. military training is very much focused on technical aspects of improving the professionalization of militaries. That's true all the way around the world. The United States cannot improve the patron-client relationships that end up making militaries corrupt and that end up making militaries ineffective and that give them dangerous political leanings after the fighting is done. And so we have to keep in mind those distinctions between what the U.S. can actually control and what it cannot. And given that supplying weapons to Ukraine could be potentially dangerous with potentially negative consequences for U.S. security interests in the region and beyond, I think it's wise to concentrate on economic and political assistance rather than offensive weapons assistance.
Okay. I'll just make one small point and then we can conclude. I think that those are all excellent arguments. I guess one thing I would say is that certainly you're right in pointing out that, looking at the history of U.S. Weapons supplies to other countries haven't gone very well. Usually we supply weapons and we don't achieve the political or military goals that we had hoped those weapons would achieve, and then the weapons end up in the hands of our enemies. One thing that might be different in this Ukrainian case that would separate it from the historical examples that you point to is that the Ukrainian society is evolving and it's heading toward a much more EU, European-oriented direction than some of the previous contexts where we've been working. So providing weapons might make sense within the broader context of providing this kind of aid to supporting genuine anti-corruption efforts within Ukraine, so that Ukraine evolves into more of a what could just be called short-term, Western-style society, where there's less chance that the weapons would go astray, which is obviously a major concern that you point to.
Can I turn you a little bit into a different direction from American interests? So back in 90s, Ukraine and Belarus surrendered their nuclear weapon, and particularly in the case of Ukraine, U.S. participated in signing this Budapest Memorandum. And U.S. kind of responsible for taking away a Ukrainian nuclear weapon that may prevent these provocations. And another point is Belarus and Ukraine moved in completely different directions, and Belarus became more and more authoritarian even than Russia. Ukraine becomes more democratic, and now Russia is building a base, a military base in Belarus. Wouldn't it be just justice if U.S. was more engaged, built a military base there in Ukraine and in response to Russian actions and supply offensive weapons?
Sufian, you raise a number of really good points. Let me just say about the Ukrainian nuclear weapons. We know that Ukraine never actually had command and control over those nuclear weapons that were located on its territory. The tactical nuclear weapons were withdrawn by Russia immediately as soon as the Soviet Union fell apart. The strategic nuclear weapons that remained there, the codes for their use remained in Moscow. So even though, you could imagine that a situation would have been there where, because because of Ukrainian expertise in constructing and in doing the scientific research behind nuclear weapons, Ukraine could have changed to make its own nuclear weapons in the future, and instead chose to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But that's a slightly different argument than saying that Ukraine should have held on to the nukes and this wouldn't have happened. Let me just say one more thing about the idea of building a U.S. military base on Ukrainian territory. We also know that now Russia is building a major military base just on the outside of Ukrainian territory. Well, George F. Kennan, who was one of the realist leaders of thinking about U.S. policy towards the Soviet Union, he invented the doctrine of containment. He said it was really important to prevent the Soviet Union from expanding, but it was also really important to take away the Soviet enemy image of the outside world, because the more that the United States did to make itself look hostile towards the Soviet Union, the more it accidentally, inadvertently supported an authoritarian regime, because an authoritarian regime needs enemies to continue functioning. And so I think as long as we make it clear that we are on the side of Ukrainian democracy and Ukrainian reform and Ukrainian Europeanization, I think those are all very good things. Even Ukrainian defense without supplying offensive weapons and without getting, I would say, God forbid, U.S. troops to be on Ukrainian territory in a new military base. We are sending the message of support, but we are also being very careful not to create a provocative situation that strengthens Putin inadvertently by giving him an enemy to fight against and therefore excusing his economic errors and his authoritarian regime.
Well, we both can't persuade Kim.
You're supposed to be a moderator who doesn't express an opinion.
Well, our last resource, let's give it to the coin to decide. So heads or tails?
Tails.
So tails. And it is tails.
Yay!
U.S. shouldn't supply Ukraine with offensive weapon. Thank you very much for participating.
That's a very wise conclusion, I think.